Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. And that's right, that's 2 podcast episodes in 1 week. Wow, weeks without a podcast, and now there's 2 in 1 week. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on, I got a lot to say. So in the last couple episodes, I kind of focused a lot of the discussion of identity. Sort of how there's nothing wrong with discussing the concept that people have identities, and people identify as things, and other people assume certain identities have certain attributes and act based on those assumptions. And my overall point was that it's okay to talk about it. It doesn't mean you're not libertarian to discuss the reality that people imperfectly make assumptions. People aren't perfect. It's, and it's just like anything else. No one's perfect, and when it comes to a lot of our sort of mental hang-ups, whether it's high anxiety, high anger, anything like that, the answer isn't, oh, I'm just going to stop having anxiety, or I'm going to stop being angry because I have a short temper. Oftentimes, the way you sort of solve your or you improve your mental health and your mental health aspect on your life is by being aware that there's imperfections and managing them. And that's all the discussion of identity is, just an acknowledging that we do have these behaviors, that we do make these assumptions, and trying to manage the negative outcomes from them. The outcomes were basically allowing ourselves to fall too much to the natural predilection to prejudice, which is, again, it's natural for us to take a look at our experiences, our knowledge, the gaps in our knowledge, the gaps in our experiences, and sort of try to fill them in with our imagination, and make assumptions. That's just natural behavior. But to the extent that might limit someone's economic opportunities or even take someone's life, because of that, we should care and we should discuss. So that's sort of my grander point. At the end of the day, prejudice, hate, these are mental health issues. And like all mental health issues, they require open discussion. A lot of the negative consequences of mental health issues, whether we take a look at these mass shootings, or we take a look at, sometimes a lot of different types of abuse, it all comes down to just not allowing people to feel open enough to discuss things that they may feel uncomfortable with themselves, that it gets bottled up, it gets pushed to the side until it manifests itself into negative ways. So it doesn't necessarily mean the government has to go pay for therapy for everybody. Not everybody necessarily needs a professional therapist, but everyone needs to be able to talk, and people need to be willing to listen. So as a libertarian, sort of the free, voluntary way to help mental health issues is to be willing to listen to people, and encourage people to talk. And you actually will make a huge difference in mental health, which will pay bounties in reduced violence, in happier people, in better economic outcomes, just by talking, just by listening. Okay, so to me, that is sort of at the root of everything. But there is sort of the immediate issue of policing, and that's sort of where everyone's been focusing their discussions on, sort of what do we do about policing, in the sense that, people have observed police do bad things. Not just murder people, which, in some situations probably escalated partly due to sort of prejudices that might have allowed things to escalate more than they would have otherwise have. Because in the sense that if you make certain assumptions about people, you might assume that you should take more escalating type actions, versus if you make other assumptions, you might take more de-escalating type actions. And thus you end up in a scenario where, someone dies. But it's not just that. It's also all the other kinds of police corruption that people have been aware of over the years. But, whether it's like cops planting evidence, or framing innocent lives, coercing testimony, all these kind of things that have happened. It doesn't necessarily mean every law enforcement officer is someone who's done these things. But these are things that happen. And it doesn't just happen because, some people are prejudiced. Some of it just happens because of also partly just kind of the culture of sort of public services. And you're starting to hear people do cries like defund the police. And here's where I'm going to try to make a point, because I think a lot of libertarians might benefit from hearing this point. that the existence of a police department, that's, a public police department, isn't the same thing as law enforcement, in the same way that the existence of a public school doesn't mean the same thing as education. Yes, a public school can be one way to provide education, and a police department can be one way to provide law enforcement, but it isn't necessarily but a publicly provided police department, in the same way like a publicly provided school, may be something that could be antiquated or hasn't evolved as quickly as it should have, may have alternatives, and actually may be counterproductive in its current state. So I would like any libertarians who feel weird about this whole sort of defund the police sentiment to think about it in the same way you think about public schools, in the sense that when you say, hey, I want to, shift to a more market-based education system, you're not saying, hey, I'm against education. You're saying that I think education can be provided better some way else. In the same way that if you are against the existence, or if you want to eliminate the police department or make a market for law enforcement, or even courts, it doesn't necessarily mean you don't believe in justice and law enforcement. Just maybe you think there's better means for providing it. And generally, better means are discovered through a market process where people try different things. But at the end of the day, a lot of these defunding movements are not necessarily just... I think there was actually one, somewhere in Minneapolis, they actually are closing down their police department. I'm not sure what they're doing after that, but that's a thing. But most places, basically, when they say defund the police, what they're just doing is reallocating some of the increase in budget. So basically, they're not really getting rid of the police. They're not even reducing their budget. They're just reducing the increase of the budget. So saying, hey, we're going to increase your budget by, let's say, $6 billion. We're going to reallocate $1 billion of that towards, let's say, public services for mental health, public services that address communities that, if unhelped, might result in you having to spend a whole bunch of time and resources enforcing laws on them. So why not spend that money to prevent those altercations from happening, than funding the altercations to begin with? So I'm sensible to that logic. I'm probably more empathetic to the idea of shifting to sort of market-based law enforcement and justice. So that way there's competition and there's discovery for new or better ways. But it's not unsound logic. But it still doesn't get at some of the deeper problems with policing, in the sense that the fact that we have so many laws, about so many things, that we're having police interactions over selling loose cigarettes, or over, selling counterfeit tapes on the sidewalk, or whatever. Like, having so many different things that require police to intervene, the more rules you make, the more laws you make, the more police have to get involved. The more times police have to get involved, the greater the odds that one of those situations becomes violent, that one of those situations escalates. So if you want to lower the probability of it, you want there to be less police interactions. And yes, better mental health can do that. Again, better mental health doesn't have to come at the cost of taxpayers. If we all just made a better effort of being better listeners and being more willing to speak on the things that are going inside of us, that would go a long way. But, a lot of these, better education, better mental health, better, better markets, all these things would contribute to an environment where you probably would have less police interactions, because people will be mentally healthier, financially healthier, and have the education to do those two things, okay? But, again, it's not so simple as just throwing money at it and saying we're going to do a thing. But yes, so less crimes, if we define less things as crimes, that will certainly reduce the amount of police interactions, which would certainly reduce the amount of times and the probability of very controversial interactions. Also, at the same time, when you have too many police interactions, when you have too many laws, you need more police to enforce those laws. There just isn't enough. So then what happens is that when you're rushing out the door to just get as many bodies inside to help enforce this ridiculous amount of laws at the local, state, and federal level. What's going to happen is like anybody else. When you start running out of people to hire that met your old standards, you create new standards, which are usually less than your old standards. So then you start having sort of a slide of quality. Okay, maybe before you wouldn't hire someone with a history of anger management issues. Well, now you're sliding because there just really isn't anybody else left. At the same time, maybe you would have more room in the budget to provide training on de-escalation or training on community building, so that way you create sort of the bridges with the community where these situations don't happen, or they happen less. But because you have to spend so much money on hiring, because you need so many bodies to enforce so many rules, it's the training that ends up getting the cut. Okay, so that way you can, because if you train people less, it's going to cost you less, and you can get people out into the field faster. There are decisions that happen in the margins. It's not like suddenly you sit there and say, hey, okay, I'm going to hire 50% less good people, and I'm going to cut training by 100%. It doesn't happen that way. It happens. It's a slow bleed. Okay, you're hiring somebody who's maybe 2% less good at first. But then you do 2% more from that and 2% more from that every once in a while as you keep hitting these walls. Okay, you cut training a little bit here, but then later on you cut it a little bit again. And little by little you realize you've gotten so far off from where you once were that you are in a place where you've made the place more dangerous, and you've gotten away from a situation where you're actually having justice and more corruption. So when it comes to policing, I mean, these sort of are my thoughts, in the sense that I'm not unsympathetic with the idea of getting rid of the police department, in the same way I'm not against getting rid of a public school. It doesn't mean I'm against education. It doesn't mean I'm against justice. It just means I'm open to having a conversation about other ways. Now, in education, of course, there's a lot sort of clear alternatives, in the sense of things like, homeschooling, private schools. When you sit there, I always forget what the name of that chain of sort of private, publicly available schools. In like Virginia, it's the Thales Institute or Thales Academy. Look that up. Good stuff. But there's also this TED Talk about, private schools in Africa that's actually really inspiring. No, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist injustice. There is private arbitration. There are private security forces, and this always comes down to the issue: like, what about the people who are poor? What about the people who can't afford, a private adjudicator or whatnot? It doesn't necessarily always. In the same way with education, other institutions oftentimes will come in to fill the gap. And if the gap's too large to be filled, then you have to ask yourself deeper economic questions, and that gets back into sort of, the economic rules and how they can sometimes make it where more people have to be poor than really need to be, because the barriers to economic empowerment are too high. And that's where we start getting into regulations and taxation and all that stuff. So it's you start pulling that thread, and it kind of leads you to this next piece of the conversation. But at the end of the day, the things we can do now is be more involved in our communities. I mean, we can reduce crime, we can fight for justice by just being better members of our community, by building up our community, by opening up conversations. Because if we all talk to each other more about our problems and listen more about our problems and care more about each other, the less likely someone's going to commit a crime, the more likely someone's going to get help when they need it, and the more likely, the situations that would necessarily need enforcement become less and less of a thing. The problem is we just kind of assume that it's going to be there. We assume that we're going to have that situation. So, at the end of the day, we make a lot of assumptions. And partly because we make so many assumptions, is kind of why we're in the problem in the first place. And it just is what it is. I don't expect we're going to ever live in a world where we make no assumptions and have no prejudices, because part of it's just sort of natural, sort of the way the brain works, where it's going to naturally try to fill gaps. And it's going to fill gaps based on what you have. And this kind of gets to now another point. So let's just kind of recap what has been so far. First, we talked about sort of hate and prejudice sort of as a mental health issue. Then I talked about policing and sort of thinking about sort of things like overcriminalization, the drug war, as far as how that creates a lot more pressure on enforcement to hire more cops, which means at a quicker rate, which could put all sorts of negative pressures. Now what I want to do is talk about another sort of criticism I hear a lot, where it's like, or this is not a criticism, this is more like I hear things getting lost in translation. So people are trying to have this conversation about culture and trying to improve the culture so more people have opportunities, less people are in life or death situations. But the problem is just sort of the way a lot of this intellectually has sort of manifested itself. This sort of language is whiteness versus blackness. And while I understand where those terminologies came from, okay, and I will expound on that, it does oftentimes make it hard for it to land with people who think you're directly talking about them. It makes it where other people lose sight of what the conversation is. They start realizing, and they start looking at it actually as white people versus black people, instead of this concept of sort of dominant culture. That's sort of what whiteness was kind of referring to, because the idea is once upon a time really was like you just had this real sort of cultural dominance sort of by white males, which is still there, but is a lot more. It's a lot different than it was. But there's still a dominant culture there that has a lot of problems. And then sort of blackness referring to sort of the non-dominant culture. Because, oftentimes while there are other sort of other groups, through a good chunk of U.S. history, and so thus in the academia, sort of you had this sort of very vocal sort of tug of war between sort of whiteness and blackness, dominant culture versus not dominant culture. And it got sort of embedded in that sort of that language. But that language kind of, again, oftentimes throws people thoughtness, because and then what happens is that you lose sight, because what can happen over time is the dominant culture may not necessarily be. And when we say dominant culture, it's just sort of like we're shaped by what's going on around us, okay? So like the TV shows I saw as a kid, the stories I heard as a kid, whatnot, these things shape my values. Some of them shape my values very positively, and like a lot of the stuff I learned being raised Catholic, about forgiveness, about kindness, that was very valuable. But also at the same time, there might be images that were very harmful, in the sense of, let's say I saw like 10 TV shows, and in 10 TV shows, the people who were in the local gang were all minorities, and none of the doctors were, okay? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that show was trying to make some sort of statement or anything like that, but it creates a pattern in my mind, which I might use to fill gaps and make assumptions. And it doesn't matter that I'm Latino, it might still lead me to be making assumptions about other Latinos. Because those images are in my mind. It's not like my mind knows like what I look like to other people on the outside. It just knows that I've intook this culture. I have this knowledge, I have these experiences, and to the best of its ability, it's going to try to fill in gaps in situations. So what we put out there, so basically, if there is a dominant culture for a variety of reasons, which, could be just sort of how certain institutions just sort of arise over time. Also could be economic power, an issue of economic power, of population, in the sense that there's just more of that people. So then what happens is that the popular culture that is consumed is going to be sort of from their lens. It just means that the people who make it, the people who consume it, they come from sort of a shared experience. So that means everyone is sort of consuming their experience, their sort of view of the world. Okay, which is not a bad thing. You want to consume as many different views of the world as possible, because no one sees everything. But the problem is when you're seeing one too much, which doesn't allow you to really see as much others. And it's not something, again, there's no sort of one culprit of this. There's no sort of heavy-handed solution. It's just something that happens. And the way you fix it is just each of us do our part to just be aware of it. And oftentimes awareness allows you to manage the issue. Okay, there's no government force that needs to be involved, no taxation, no levies, just a conversation and a level of awareness. Yeah, so basically, that's what they mean when you hear like lens, and you think of like Laura Mulvey and like the lens. So I think like if I remember, it's been a while since in my undergrad, and we talked a lot about this stuff, where basically, a lot of film was created from like a sort of where the scripts were written by men, the movies were directed by men. So sort of the portrayal of women was very much sort of this sort of male idealized version of what they want a woman to be, of how they see a woman. Problem is, girls grow up, they see all their pop culture from this lens. It becomes a sort of feedback cycle, which can be, can lead to insecurity in that case. It could lead to positive stereotypes. People who might see other people as better than them and portray that in their culture. But then, it's not that, a lot of times we think, well, everyone's a little racist, everyone has stereotypes. But the issue becomes when you start getting to stereotypes that really, really have sort of grander negative impacts, which means generally any kind of stereotype that leads you to be scared of someone, or to assume someone is like less intelligent, because those are things that actually affect people economically. And if you're scared of someone, you're going to feel more need to defend yourself, which will lead you to quickly make decisions that might lead to taking someone's life in a situation you didn't need to. So that's why where this sort of cultural lens really kind of matters, but it's not necessarily like. So when people talk about like whiteness, they're just talking about the lens that sort of dominates culture. They're not necessarily saying only like, well, let me rephrase that. The conversation should be this. Okay, I think because of the terminology is so confusing in some ways, that it has, to a lot of people, it is just sort of this like, there's people who are white and they inherently think a certain way, and there's other people. And I think that is not productive. But to the extent that there's sort of a division of labor, a structure of production to culture, and the structure, how culture gets the division of labor and the structure of production of culture can have different consequences. In the same way that the production of money has different consequences, like who makes the money. So when the Federal Reserve prints the money, and gives it to the banks first, it has certain consequences to how power is distributed. In the same way, who creates culture and how that culture gets distributed has an impact on who has power and how we see each other. So, yeah. So I think that is what I want to say, in the sense that just basically it's because people will point out, it's like, oh, well, look, a black cop was there when another black person was killed. Like, that doesn't necessarily mean that the same reasoning for why things happen didn't exist. Because we don't know what's going on in people's heads. We don't know what's going on in people's hearts. People of the same category could still be making the same assumptions about each other that are still informed by the same cultural lens. And the more we make it about like each other, and we sit there and say, well, I need you to feel bad or apologize or whatever, instead of less like, how do we fix our culture, like, or how do we improve it, or what can we do to manage this?